All right, so we are going to look at the Renaissance in this review. This is review number 6, if you are counting. I'll write that down. And so we're going to look at the Renaissance, Mannerism, and then we're going to start Baroque. So remember, Renaissance is rebirth. Renaissance is a time period that's going to revisit the classical ideals of humanism, right? Man is the measure of all things. We talked about with humanism being a very Greek idea. But with the Renaissance, we're looking at those humanist ideals of the classical period of the Greeks, but they were applying that with a Christian kind of concept of divine knowledge and divine wisdom. And so if we think about summing up the Renaissance, this is kind of a good quote here. All human knowledge exists under divine wisdom. And so this idea that yes, all these pursuits of mankind are important, whether it's academic pursuits, athleticism, pride in government and culture, all those things, but under the umbrella of Christianity, okay? Art in the Renaissance is going to become more intellectual and less about, just making something, but instead this concept of artist as genius, right? And so the artist is going to do what the artist wants to do. Remember, the Renaissance starts in Florence and then it thrives in Rome. So here at Florence, we have Brunelleschi's Pazzi Chapel. So the Pazzi Chapel is a small chapel on the backside of a basilica in Florence. It is a meeting house. It's based on that concept of circle and square. It's a very orderly, rational design, compact. Since it's a meeting house for a group of monks, it's small, right? It doesn't need to hold a bunch of people for mass. It's a small space. Circle and square throughout the site. This is where we had the innovation of the glazed tile or glazed clay, vitrified color of glazing. That's done by Luca della Robbia. And then Petra Serena. That's very typical of anything we see from the Renaissance from Florence. Petra Serena. So it's the green gray stone on the white background. All right, we can't talk about the Renaissance in Italy or in Florence without the Medici. The Medici are a very rich banking family that has close ties to royalty. They are at one point run out of Florence, but then they come back. And so there's a complex, long history here. The Medici choose to have themselves depicted as members of characters in the Bible. They use art as a way to self promote. So David, this is our sassy David, right, by Donatello. It has this kind of elaborate contrapposto sway to his hip. He's a young David. He is standing on the severed head of Goliath. And we talked about how this story is a story of victory. It's a story of the underdog winning, right? And so David was a young boy. Goliath was a hardened, seasoned, giant warrior. And yet David was able to defeat him with a single rock and a slingshot. And so here David looks confident in his victory. He's holding the giant sword of Goliath, right? And then he has on a very Florentine hat. And we talk about with this work, there are definitely undertones of homoeroticism. And that would have to do with the fact that Donatello was a gay man who was very much into kind of exploring these gender identity. And he's showing that in the kind of flamboyance of this pose here. And this was made, we believe, for the Medici's courtyard at their home, and it was set up on a plinth so it looked down on people, and you can see how David's kind of looking down there. And so this is not only a symbol of David beating Goliath, it's also a symbol of the Medici as victorious in coming back to Florence, and it's a symbol of the whole city of Florence adopted David as their patron saint, as a symbol of the fact that they were able to be victorious over Siena and Milan, even though those were, Milan especially was a larger area, that Florence was able to defeat them, right? Or at least keep them at bay and stay its own province. This is our first freestanding nude since antiquity, and it's our first nude Bible hero. So typically we see characters from the Bible as being, if they're nude, they're sinful, like Adam and Eve. But here we see nudity not as something to be ashamed of. The Palazzo ritualized by Alberti. Alberti made this structure to be better, similar to, but better than the Medici Palazzo here in Florence. We talked about how the exterior is the 3 different styles of Roman or Greek column, which is based on the layout of the Colosseum. We have the barrel arches, the very decorative flat pilasters. It has the brick pattern. This is from antiquity. This is something he had uncovered from antiquity, in the bench on the outside for regular people, and then a really heavy cornice going across the top. The cornice was decorated with symbols of victory and the family name, the family shield. Petrus Arena on the courtyard on the interior. All right. So this is a painter named Friar Filippo Lippi. Fra Lippi was the bad boy. Remember, he was the one that unfortunately was raping nuns and was not following his orders of being a monk or just a good person. So Lippi was a painter who worked a lot for the Medici. Here he has humanized the story of Mary and child being Jesus. And then the 2 angels are kind of supporting Jesus here. So this work is about humanizing, how he's made the story more real by making these characters look more realistic, more 3-dimensional. We have all those symbols. This is a change from the type of Mary and Jesus we've seen before, like Virgin Theotokos. We talk about this being a change because she's more proportional, she's more realistic, she looks more like a real person. She's set in a home, not in a golden realm of spiritual life. Lots of symbols that talk about why we know this is Jesus and how this is holy and how this looks sacred. Lots of dramatic scandal with that man. All right, so that's when a group of weirdos that I love from 5th period reenacted this. All right, so Birth of Venus by Botticelli, also commissioned by the Medici. And it's a work that was a tempera on canvas. It was part of a series of work for the Medici, retelling stories from the mythological past. The first non-religious nude since antiquity. We talked about that idea of Neoplatonism and that this ideals of beauty as actually being spiritual. This has those decorative qualities of line. Remember that Botticelli worked with Fra Lippi, and so there's a lot of similarity in the figures. All right, High Renaissance moves us into the Last Supper, and there's some details about High Renaissance. Again, y'all have these PowerPoints. So Da Vinci's Last Supper, this was painted on the wall of a dining room in a refectory, a dining room in a monastery in Milan. It shows true perspective and depth. It has the mathematic perfection of the grouping of the characters, Jesus in isolation in the center. This is depicting the Last Supper from the New Testament. It's very rational, reasonable layout. Christ makes kind of that isosceles triangle. This is in terrible condition because of the material he used of the oil paint plus tempera. You on a wall? No. This is was preserved after the Blitz in World War II. All right, Sistine Chapel. This was made in two parts. So remember, the ceiling was High Renaissance. The back wall, the altar wall we see here at the back, is Mannerism, right? So what we call late Renaissance. So this was made in two parts. It was made by Michelangelo, and it was given to him by Pope Julius II, was the patron. And remember, he wanted him to fail, and that was a ruse that he'd come up with Raphael, who wanted him to fail. All right, so it's 9 scenes across the top. The 9 scenes are from the Old Testament. They start with creation of the world, Adam and Eve, and they go all the way to the sin of Noah, the drunkenness of Noah. And then along the side, we have these sibyls that are kind of secular foretellings of the truth of Jesus Christ according to the Catholic faith. At the back, on the back wall, because things have changed, things have gotten more tumultuous, the Protestant Reformation has begun. So there's a little bit more chaos on the back wall, and you can tell by the colors, you can tell by the proportions of the figures, by the arrangement. You can just tell looking at this picture, there's more chaos in this judgment scene on the back wall than there is the narrative on the top, on the ceiling. Cesnina was the one who had spoken out against Michelangelo. Not everyone liked these nude pictures in churches. The Sistine Chapel, remember, is a space to elect a new pope, and it's also where the pope can hold mass. School of Athens at the Stanza della Signatura was happening just down the hall from the Sistine Chapel. And we know that Raphael was very influenced by Michelangelo's work, and we can tell that in his the way he paints the figures and the way he has the use of color and fresco. So there's a lot of similarity here. This is a very rational layout, much like Da Vinci's Last Supper. It has true perspective. It is based on that circle and square of an ideal space. It is every great thinker up to that point. These people did not all actually live at the same time. So this is an imagined scene. Plato and Aristotle are in the middle. Late Renaissance, Mannerism. Mannerism is going to be our transition to Baroque. And so Mannerism is going to be where things start getting less classical perfection and more emotional, dramatic scenes, but not the emotion and drama of Baroque. So it's a transition period. Mannerism is very decorative. It's very much a stylistic complexity. We start to see twisting of figures, distortion. So the Entombment of Christ by Jacopo de Pontormo, this has not been on the AP exam before, so this would be a great piece to talk about change. I would definitely look over this piece, thinking about the idea of a narrative, a capture of a narrative without having the full story, like a limited point. It's a painting made for a chapel. Very graceful, but chaotic and impossible. A lot of impossibility in this work. Chiaroscuro is always a good form word to talk about for Renaissance. And then we moved into more Mannerism here, which, again, remember, Mannerism is late Baroque. This is Titian's Venus of Urbino. It's our first use of oil paint in Italy. Started our genre of the female nude. We don't know who she is for sure. We know this was made as a gift. You've talked about that piece a lot. And so it leads us to other reclining nudes later on. Baroque is that time period where the Catholic Church is really trying to win back souls for the church, because what has happened at this point is the Protestant Reformation has started. And so all of a sudden, Catholic churches start pouring all this money into arts programs to create dramatic works that are going to bring people back. So make sure you're familiar with those ideas from the Renaissance to Baroque. Wavy lines, spirals, twist, theatrics, extreme light and dark. Okay, we call tenebrism. The straight lines of the Renaissance are replaced with curves. This is Baroque is part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So Il Gesù, Triumph in the Name of Jesus. This is a church that had the ceiling that kind of opened up, and it looked like it was supposed to be the second coming of Jesus. And so, which is kind of a judgment scene, but you have the people being pushed down to hell. That's this kind of mass of dark people. And then you have the light people going up to heaven. And so the ceiling looks like it opens up. Remember, this was done through the use of theatrical kind of stage setup, that a lot of these figures are painted on the ceiling, but then some of them are actually painted on three-dimensional partitions of wood that hang a little bit lower than the ceiling. And so you have this multi-level dramatic scene there. Calling of St. Matthew, Baroque, another moment of transformation, of change. This is a sinner becoming a saint, very common in Baroque. We talked a lot about Caravaggio, so make sure you know this work. San Carlo Quattro, this is a good example. Some people call it San Carlo, San Carlito, a good example of change, because you have Corinthian columns, you have a facade of a sacred space, you have balustrades, you have niches for sculpture, you have these things that sound classical, but in this presentation with that undulating wave of the front, it's not, I mean, it's a big change from the classical. So remember, Borromini was a stone carver. This church, instead of having a rectangular basilica, has this oval kind of based off of the triangle, because they were Trinitarian sect. And then it has this undulating kind of stone carved ceiling, rather. Complex designs. And then how could you forget Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa? I think we've talked about this work a lot. Remember, this is Baroque. Colored marble, theatrics, all very expected of the Baroque. Exterior of the church looks similar to Il Gesù.